Are you on the lookout for a plant that is interesting and has some movement? A plant that might not fit neatly into the categories of philodendron, anthuriums and monstera? Stick around with me for this really interesting and unusual plant review. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So today I'm going to do a review video. I haven't done one of these in a while, but this is for a plant that a lot of people were asking me, do I have I showcased it? And yes, I do have this plant, and this is the best way that I can consider in terms of showcasing this. So this one goes out to all the people that have got this plant, are thinking of getting this plant, or maybe want to discover a plant that's a bit more interesting. So the plant I'm going to be talking about today, and let me pick it up, is this beauty. And you can see it's a caudiciform plant, and it has got kind of biggish leaves. At the moment it's coming back from its winter dormancy, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. And this beautiful plant is called the Phyllanthus Mirabilis or Mirabilis. So coming into background with this plant, this one was an interesting one in terms of how it came to my care. But before we do that, this obviously, as I mentioned, is a caudiciform plant, and for those that might not know what a caudiciform plant is a plant that has a caudex. So it's kind of like a swollen stem, which is kind of usually quite large and a bit woody basically. Another one of these that you might have seen is the Stephania erecta, and that's one that a lot of people wanted to get at some point. I know there was some controversy with that specific plant in terms of it being poached from nature because it takes such a long time to kind of form its codex. And I don't know whether or not there's the same kind of drama about this specific plant, but this plant kind of came onto the market around the same time that the Stephania erecta did, because a lot of people were trying to get that plant. It wasn't as easy to find, but there was a lot more of this available basically. And for the people that are sick and tired of aroids, I am pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure this is not an aroid, so there you go. But this is a plant that, if I'm not mistaken, is, or kind of at least the majority of the phylanthuses are kind of endemic to Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, basically. So that kind of part of the world there. And if I'm not mistaken with this one, it tends to be one that grows on kind of limestone, that's the word, cliffs and mountains, basically. And one of the things that makes this quite interesting, and this is important in the background section of things, obviously you might be able to see kind of how the leaves are right there. And these are newish leaves that are coming in just now, so they've got a slight tinge to them. They do go kind of just a regular deepish green, I would say, depends on where you have this. I tend to give this the same amount of light that I do for my succulents, but I'll touch on that a bit in care. But the really interesting thing about this specific plant, and I'm not entirely sure if other phylanthuses do the same thing, but this does something when it comes to movement at night specifically, and I'll see if I can find a picture, or at least take a picture of nighttime when I'm editing this video and kind of put it up here so you can kind of see it. These are kind of, you might be able to see the leaves aren't entirely flat. They've got a kind of cup shape, kind of the way that they're kind of sitting at the moment. They're not entirely flat like that. And they will eventually go like that at some point today, but it's still relatively early in the morning and they've only just started opening up. And what this plant does is at night it closes its leaves, kind of very similar to potentially what some calathea and prayer plants would do, where they kind of, the leaves go upright. This does the same thing, but because you can see the leaves come in little double sets, it does actually look like kind of praying hands. It's very, very cool. And I've talked about kind of closing leaves on plants, and part of what a lot of scientists believe that to be is it makes the plant look smaller, so less obvious to potentially kind of animal predators that might go and munch on the leaves, if it's not quite as kind of in your face, they might miss it and go for another plant to eat. So that is the predominant kind of theory behind why some of these plants move their leaves upwards to make them look a bit smaller, basically. But in terms of background on how it got into my care, this was a plant that a while back, I think this plant I've probably had for about 6, maybe 7 years at this point. And you might be looking at it going, it's not very, very impressive. And I got it in a very similar state, like the actual cortex hasn't grown too much. I don't know if it's the way that I'm growing it that means that it hasn't grown too much, or the fact that this might take a while to grow generally. But this is a plant that, yeah, as I said, I've had it for a good few years. I heard or saw somebody talk about this plant, and I can't remember if it was Plant Daddy podcast that mentioned this, or maybe I saw it somewhere online. And this is before there was a bit of this that came on the market, and again, I'll touch on that in just a moment. But this was a plant that wasn't easily available, at least where I am in the UK, and I would imagine Europe back then. So the only way I could get my hands on this was to look at something like eBay. There was literally one seller, and I think the seller was in Scotland, and they had one of these plants that they just kind of fell out of love with, and they were just like, I'm just going to try and sell it on eBay, and I purchased this plant from them. So this plant is probably even older than what I've got it. Obviously with caduciform plants, obviously they do take a while to grow. And you might be able to see the growth pattern there. So there was a growth point at this little node here, which I cut off at some point because this plant also goes dormant in the kind of winter months. And it generally has done so in my care. Not always, but at least in this property it has. And it's interesting because I've had this in 3 different properties and it's reacted differently to all 3 different properties. But yeah, that's a bit of background on the Phyllanthus Mirabilis. So let's talk about speed of growth for this one. And it's an interesting one because, again, I'll show you the leaves and I'll show you kind of the structure of it as it is currently, basically. And this is a plant that, in my care, as I just mentioned, can go dormant or cannot, basically. And generally for a lot of people, I would imagine that this is a plant that will go dormant in the winter. And boy, what happens when, it goes dormant in the winter? It will literally drop all of its leaves. The same way that you would get with like deciduous trees, and you're still left with the very woody structures. You might think, oh no, it's dead. What do I do? Don't panic. Just continue to water it very sporadically. Treat this very similar to what you would do with a succulent at that time of the year. Not necessarily a cactus. I still water this just very infrequently in the winter months. I will actually let the soil go dry between waterings just to see that it's actually using the water. And as with most of these things, when you do let it go dry, flush it, and then it should be fine. But in terms of its speed, I would say with this one, when it's in active growth, like right now, this had the smallest little leaflets a week ago. And this is now at this stage, basically. So when it starts going, it is very, very fast. But you do have that down period, which is kind of those winter months where it's not doing very much. It's just a really boring kind of stemmy plant with not very much interest. So there is a bit of a balance, but when it is in active growth, it is relatively fast, I would say. Now, ease of propagation with this one, I don't know. I'm going to be completely honest, I don't know. I have not tried to propagate this plant. But based on some of the research I've done on this plant, from what I can see, there are 2 main ways of being able to propagate this plant. One being through seeds. I still haven't ever got this to flower, let alone go to seed. But the other one is through cuttings, and I would imagine it would be the soft cuttings. So it would be kind of taking something like this. You desperately need to let it callus over, so you need to let it dry out before you put it into some soil mixture and let it kind of root out from there. I think I have attempted it once, but I think I tried to do it in water. I probably wouldn't do that. I might put this into something like a propagation box or prop box. So high humidity, some damp sphagnum moss, and some light on it, and then see how it goes. But if you've propagated this specific plant successfully and you want to share what you did and kind of your success rate, do let us all know down below in the comments. Now coming into availability for this plant, and as I kind of touched on a bit earlier, this is an interesting one. This is not a plant that I see even when it was at its height super frequently, basically. So when I first was trying to get this, it wasn't very readily available at all. I know a lot of people don't always necessarily have the best success with caudiciform plants. I will have to compare this to the Stephania erecta because that might be the one that most people are kind of aware of kind of a caudiciform plant that tends to have kind of more standard leaves as you might expect them to be. I know the Stephania erecta has got those kind of disc-shaped leaves that everybody goes gaga over. But this one, in my experience, is easier than that one to kind of get going, to kind of get it back from the winter dormancy, all of these things. And this is a plant that, as I mentioned, it did have a bit of a heyday. I kind of hesitate to say this. Maybe a year or two ago, at least here in the UK, and I would imagine in Europe as well, where I was able to find this in some kind of more specialist plant stores and garden centres. And they usually had a big form of this. It was usually on the kind of gravelly situation. So with this, and I'll touch on this in care, obviously treat it like a succulent or a cactus in terms of its media. But the reason why I never picked up a bigger version of this plant, and I would have loved to, is one, I did take pause to kind of go, I know how slow my one grows, and if those caudiciforms are so big, were they taken from nature? And I'm not entirely comfortable with doing that, kind of encouraging that, at least with this. My kind of thought process is somebody else owned it and they were going to get rid of it, which is a shame because they take such a long time to grow and be happy, that I will definitely give it a home. But the thing that I had an issue with those is, at least as far as I could tell, and it's one of the few times I've seen it in the UK and Europe, is we got that kind of notion of what happens a lot from what I've seen from a lot of people in America with some of the box stores over there, where you get the glued on rocks at the top of the soil level and it's just a bit like, okay. So I think that was what it was, and I really wasn't comfortable with that with a plant. I'm just like, I know the Cordex doesn't grow that quickly, but I'm just a bit like, I don't know. So I didn't purchase it then. If I remember correctly back then, I don't think this was a particularly expensive plant. This is before I started tracking how much I was paying for it. From eBay when I got this, maybe £20 back then, maybe a bit less probably. And it did come, the shipping was a bit interesting on this one. It was in leaf, and by the time it came to me, it still had the leaves, but a couple of days later it dropped all of them. But because it was kind of around this time of the year, it did kind of grow back its leaves relatively quickly, basically. But I remember when they were selling those bigger, more established ones, around, you were looking at somewhere between 40 and I think maybe the highest I'd ever seen it for the really, really big ones was maybe 100 to 120 pounds, Great British pounds, basically. So it wasn't the cheapest of things, but I do know, probably more so now when a lot of you have reached out to me who have owned this plant or still own this plant, saying it doesn't get enough time in the spotlight, and I do agree with you, and this is why I'm doing this video, to give it a bit of its own spotlight. But yeah, it's one that obviously people did purchase, and I think based on the fact that people are still asking about it, there's probably still some interest, or at least there are people that have got it and they're just kind of going, oh, there's not a lot of people talking about this, so I don't know. So price-wise, I wouldn't imagine this would drop too drastically because the demand isn't there for it in mass, basically. But nonetheless, a very cool plant. Let's talk pests with this plant. And the one predominant pest that I have always had on this plant, not 100% of the time, but it's been worse in this situation because, and you can all guess where I'm going with this, mealybugs. But from what I can see online, mealybugs is one of the plant pests that you would get generally on the Phyllanthus Mirabilis. I'm always trying to catch myself because I want to say Cerasestis mirabilis, but that's an entirely different plant. Phyllanthus Mirabilis. And it's interesting, I'm not entirely sure with the Phyllanthus because, again, going back to my kind of Greek heritage, philos or philo, it could mean one or two things, basically. Philo is either gender or leaf, or it could also mean friend, philos or philos, basically. And thos would generally mean bloom or a flower, basically. So I'm curious as to why this plant is named the way that it is. As I said, I've never got it to bloom in my care. It might be glaringly obvious to anybody who has had this plant bloom for them to just kind of go, yeah, it makes sense as to why that plant is called what it is, basically. But yeah, mealybugs, sorry, back to pests. Mealybugs for this are the big thing, and they will be all along the kind of caudiciform kind of stem and the kind of woodier parts of this plant. I know some people might struggle with scale, which is very closely related to mealybugs with this. Some people might have spider mite issues. I don't think I've ever had spider mite issues with this. But yes, mealybugs does get a bit intense on this. I will say though, because sometimes these types of plants tend to be very, very sensitive, and when they get pests, they might abort all of their leaves. This one doesn't. It starts looking a bit ratty, and I've already had to remove some of the mealybugs. I did remove the mealybugs when it lost all of its leaves in the winter, and it didn't have any of them come back again. Now that it's back in active growth, it's when it's starting to get those mealybugs again. I'm hoping this year to stay on top of it, because at some point this was massively infested. It still didn't kill the plant, and it still had greenery on it. So that should tell you something about the pests on this one. Spider mites, I would imagine, with the leaves being as thin as they are, it's something you're going to need to kind of look at. The leaves on this as well, I'd be very careful with how you kind of handle them, because they are very, very thin, basically. But yeah, those would be the big ones that I would kind of really pay attention to with this one. I don't think, touch wood, I've ever had thrips on this, basically, or anything else for that matter. So keep an eye for scale, mealybugs, possibly spider mites on this plant. Now, accessories and care. So you might have noticed, terracotta pot. Anything I can do, I'm treating this essentially like a succulent or a cactus. So anything I can do to remove that moisture quickly from the actual plant and the root mass is a good thing, especially during the winter months. I like to always consider these types of plants, so the succulents, the cacti, the ones that don't need an awful lot of water and they're not used to getting them, I judge them not on what they're going to need during the growing season, but what they can tolerate in the dormant season, basically. So things like terracotta is a must, or at least a plastic pot with a lot of holes, something that will relieve some of that moisture quickly, basically. Even if it just means you might need to water a tiny bit more frequently in the summer. In terms of media, again, with this one, and it's interesting because a lot of people will generally say use a cactus or succulent mix to this, something really fast draining. And I did have it and it didn't do as well. And then I moved it into an aroid soil mix, and it seems to do okay. It might be that in combination with the terracotta, but it seems to be doing better for me. I just know to really pull back on the watering. And when I say pull back on the watering in this, in the kind of winter dormancy period, I would pull back to maybe once a month. And I mentioned earlier on that sometimes I've had winters where I've had this in leaf, and sometimes I've had it when it went fully dormant. I'm trying to think if I ever had to go through an entire season of it not dropping all of its leaves and not having even the smallest bit of dormancy. And I don't think I ever did. I think at some point, no, I did. For a couple of years of its life, I did. Light and heat are going to be the big deciding factors for this to not go particularly dormant in the winter. It will, and I will say this, even when I had it in leaf, it does look a bit busted, basically, over the winter, because it's not doing very much. And usually what will then happen is you'll get another growth point, which is the summer growth point, and whatever was there from the winter before, at least this has been my experience, will drop off and it will favor that new summer growth, basically. So that's most of what I've ever seen kind of on this plant. And you can see there's multiple little stems that are growing from this plant. So that is quite cool, even though there is that one long thing. You'll get some interesting shapes with this, I will say this. And then in terms of light with this one, a lot of what you would find online will kind of say bright and direct light, and it might tolerate a bit of direct light. I've usually had this in relatively bright light situations. It's not baking to the same level that I would have my cactus or succulent, but it's not quite bright and direct light. I will put it somewhere that's even brighter than that, if that makes sense. And it seems to do really well. It does desperately need the light. And obviously have it somewhere where you can probably see it. It doesn't need an awful lot of humidity. I've always had this in high humid situations, and at some point I moved it out into my living room, where there's a fireplace going in the winter and all of these things, and it's been completely fine. Would it appreciate a tiny bit of humidity? Yes, but having it constantly in a space like this was okay. It didn't harm it basically, but I don't think it necessarily needs it. So this is one that should be okay in most household humidity environments. The other thing that I will say about this, especially if you don't want it to go dormant, and this is the dormancy that I've started seeing with this, not just the light, but also the heat. It does need to, if you can keep it over the winter above 20 degrees, and some of the people that have been around for this winter and the previous winter, due to energy prices, and also because I wanted to test it, I have let my conservatory go a bit colder, go down to maybe 15, 16 degrees Celsius in the winter. This plant, it just meant that it just went in dormancy basically. But when I had it warmer and it was still getting a lot of light, so for instance, when I gave it a bit of a grow light in the winter, it kept everything. But it's up to you on whether or not that's something you want to do for it. Now, in terms of fertilizing for this, it still gets watered the same way that I would water everything else in my care, so it gets a weak fertilizer solution year round. Even in the winter, which I probably shouldn't do, and actually maybe in the winter I'll try to water this separately with just some plain water, but it's never really harmed it, if I'm being completely honest. So let me put this plant down and let's talk through some final thoughts, and I'll give you a bit of a score on this plant. I haven't done one of these reviews in a while. I'm loving it. I'm kind of like, ooh, review video. It hasn't happened for a while. But final thoughts on this one. It is a plant that I've really enjoyed growing, basically. It's one that's still in my collection. I kind of gave up on the Stephanie erecta. I'm trying to think. I had another one that kind of, I'm trying to remember, I'll see if I can put the name up there. That one I have tried growing for a while. That one is a vigorous viner and grower, like it's got little heart-shaped leaves, and the cortex looks a bit like a kind of tortoise shell. I'm okay with that, but that one gets infested with mealybugs, and there's so many nooks and crannies, and it's so delicate that I'm just like, I don't know if I can be bothered with that one anymore. This one is a much sturdier plant, and I'm kind of surprised that more people aren't gravitating towards this over some of the others, because I found this to be a lot hardier than some of the others, and there's a bit more interest. I know the heart-shaped leaves or the disc-shaped leaves, and this one's leaves are a bit more plain and simplistic, but that nighttime closing of the leaves, it hasn't got old yet, if that makes sense. It's really cool. I'm just like, oh, look, it's closed down for night. It's gone baby bye-byes. So yeah, I do really quite enjoy this plant still to this day. It tells you how many years I've had this in my collection, and I'm not planning on getting rid of it anytime soon. But scoring wise, it's an interesting. So 0 being the worst, 10 being the best. I would give this a 7, I think. I think a 7, yeah. I would probably score it a bit higher because it does bring me a lot of joy, but if I'm thinking about it from everybody else's point of view, this would be a good plant to own for a lot of different people. It's adaptable to different conditions. It does have that dormancy period. Treat it like a succulent. For me, it's more interesting than a succulent, so that's why I'm giving it a bit of a better score. But I'm really curious to see if you own this plant. Were you even aware of this plant? Let me know in the comments down below. But if you do own this plant or have owned this plant, have your experiences been different than mine? Do let us all know, and let's have that conversation down below. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.